welcome back to the Talk Past podcast. I am your host, of course, NC, and today we're going to talk about the S.C.A., which some of us, of course, in the fair do, but I have someone here as a guest who solely does that. So introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Zoe Mead, but I'm also known in the S.C.A. as Her Lady Runa Gidya. I love all things medieval, which is how I got started with the S.C.A. Kind of accidentally, actually. It's a funny story, but I've been in the S.C.A. about 5 years now, and it takes up a very large part of my everyday life.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much mood with what we do as well.
I'm sure.
I started about 10 years on an accident as well. We opened the group, Grand Wizarding World of Harry Potter and Universal, and we were just hanging out at one of their hotel rooms, and they're like, "Hey, you want to do this too?" I'm like, "Okay, whatever." And then 10 years later, doing that and more. But let's focus specifically on the topic. So, what is S.C.A.?
So the S.C.A. is the Society for Creative Anachronism. It's a society that has a long and torrid history. Now, admittedly, I've not been in as long as a lot of people, but the story I've always been told, and the story that you can find on our official wiki, one of their we call it the first party, was held in, I believe it was Berkeley, California. It's UCLA. And it was this group of friends, and one of the friends had, I think, gotten a master's in medieval studies or something like that. So they threw this big party in the yard, and then they had a parade to protest the modern era or modern ages, and from that was born the S.C.A. And like a lot of like relatively famous people, and like even in like what we say mundane, which are things that are not S.C.A. related, that's your mundane life. Authors and a lot of pagans and everyone like that were a part of that quote unquote first party. A long time it was kind of a lot more high fantasy. It was still a lot of like historical reenactment, but you could we say past names because you pick an S.C.A. name like Arwen, or one of my favorite bards on earth is Baldwin of Erebor, which is of course the mountain in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. And then at some point we grew so big that we became, I think it's a 501c non-for-profit. And part of that switch was we became really focused on the historical. So people are still welcome to show up and be kind of high fantasy, but if you want an official persona, if you want to win awards, if you want to be officially recognized, you have to have a historical persona that's based somewhere between the fall of the Roman Empire. Mostly, it's usually like 800 to the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Any culture that you can back up, but it has to be kind of within that time period. And everything you do as far as your clothing, your name, your heraldry, your coat of arms, all of that has to be based within that realm of historical reenactment now.
Yeah, very much same here. Now, what I do is specifically, at least at first, was medieval stage combat, so theater combat. However, we're integrating medieval Western martial arts, or HEMA, into that kind of mix and match. Really, it's not like strict, but we were very strict in the same way of being historical. Everything had to be historically accurate, even if the festival itself is more of like a Renaissance festival. It's medieval themed, but it's still a festival, so you still have the same things that you're going to go when you go to a fair. Sometimes we did a scenario that was fantasy, like King Arthur, very specifically King Arthur. But yeah, no, we were pretty strict in terms of historical accuracy, right down to literally the fabrics you wear for your socks and such. And
Ooh, I like that.
I imagine the same thing. That's really instilled a lot into me. Now my life is my aesthetic used to be sort of like a sort of postmodern, and now it's very much medieval, prehistoric. But in regards to S.C.A., in terms of what you guys do, like what do you guys actually do beyond the description?
So that is a very open question because we do just about everything. I guess we can focus on the 4 paths, or I suppose 5. A big part of the S.C.A. Now, not everyone does this, and I think you can be as legitimate and a Scadian if you choose not to, but is a peerage, which is an official. Whether or not you want to call it an award is some amount of controversy between people, but it's sort of like the end goal for a lot of people. We've got 5 of those. We have Pelican, which is service, Knight, which is fighting hardsuit specifically, a Master of Defense, which is fighting rapier, a Laurel, which is artistry, and a Royal Peer, which is someone who's won crown and served as a royal, or as a baroness served in the royal capacity. And those sort of 5 paths really are a great example of what the S.C.A. does. We have people who are there for service. They want to run events. They want to be helpful. They want to do jobs. They want to make the wheels of the society turn. We have people who are there to fight hardsuit or rapier. We also have archers. We have, thrown weapons, spears, but they're there to get into it with the battling. Again, the Masters of Defense, there for rapier, there for all of that fun. The Laurel's artistry, any kind of historical artistry you can think of. I know someone who has their Laurel in period magic tricks. I know Laurels who are there to be bards, which is personally what my path is. I'm a bard first and foremost. Glass blowers, illumination and calligraphy, which are the beautiful artistry that you find in old books. It's the calligraphy is writing, illumination is the designs and art that were found on paper. Cooking, medicinal medicines, all of that you can get laurels for. Sewing, anything like that. Really, if you can think of an art or what we call a science, which would be something like brewing or medicinal herbs or that, you can get a laurel in it. And then the royals are the people who won crown and have served their kingdom or served their barony, and they're there to really be kind of the cornerstones of the S.C.A. And that is, of all of those things you can do, many people have multiple peerages because they just can't pick one. But those, like, what we do is we try and take those paths, and then we do our best to try and come at it from a period perspective. Now, it's creative anachronism. We try and make that very clear. So, like, when you're a fighter, for example, our kits, we call them, sometimes they're made out of plastic from pickle barrels, or we're trying to be as safe as possible. We recently introduced, I don't know if we're calling it HEMA, but we're calling it live combat, so real steel. But that started just before COVID, so we haven't really gotten to see how that looks, and there's a lot more rules that come with that, of which there should be, because it is far more dangerous and far more involved than hardsuit, which is what we call our fighting style. But our when we're fighting, it's made out of plastic, and we're wearing kidney belts and everything like that. When you're making your first garb, your first outfit, like my outfits now, I play a 9th century Viking. Well, Viking was a job, not a culture, but when you say Viking, everybody knows what you're talking about. So I'm happy to call it that. I play a 9th century Viking vulva, which is a kind of spiritual leader and witch / skald, which is a kind of bard. My outfits now are made out of linen and wool, and very historically to what we know from finds that we've seen. Whereas when I first started, I was in, some cotton nonsense that I sewed that a Viking never would have been caught dead in, but you're doing your best to be as accurate as you reasonably can. And so that's sort of like what we do in the S.C.A. is we are a bunch of medieval nerds gotten together. We're like, we want to live in the Middle Ages, but alas, it is the 20th century. So we're going to make this little piece for ourselves, and we're going to do all of these things with each other.
Exactly, mood. Same here. But hardsuit, you mentioned hardsuit. What do you mean by hardsuit? Like what we do is we use, obviously we're strict in terms in the same way of being historical. So people are wearing actual gambesons, actual plate armor. Do you mean something of that nature?
Kind of. We're a little bit less strict. Now, I've fought hardsuit, but not in any great, to a very small extent. I'm starting to get back into it. we're a little bit less strict. If I'm remembering these rules correctly, and I could be remembering them incorrectly, there's certain parts of your body that are required to be covered. So you have to have a helmet, you have to protect your kidneys, your crotch, all of that. But within that, some people try and do really historically accurate, like I have a 12th century Italian persona, and this is what they would wear. I have a 9th century Scandinavian persona. This is what they would historically wear. But we are, as a whole, very less strict about that. Most people have real, true metal helmets. We do require that, and most people will make scale mail is very popular, or chess pieces that are made out of plastic and covered with canvas are very popular. But we're really, no one's there with a magnifying glass. Like, that's historical, and that's not on the field, because really the goal of the field is to be safe and to be happy. So we are, I think, out of every aspect of the S.C.A, that's in fact, that and food when you're camping are the two parts where we're actually the least historically accurate. Whereas I know what you do, and what, like, let's say when you're going up to a truly historical reenactment group, which we're technically not, because we're not picking out real battles and stuff. Like, they're very much like you said, the fabric you're using is accurate. The outfits that you're wearing are accurate. The armor is exact to that person, like how they would live. We tend to focus less on that. We just call it hard suit, as far as I can tell, because rapier can wear soft fabrics. They have to have a certain amount of tension, so that if a sword breaks, it won't stab you. Whereas when you're fighting a stick, because we don't use swords, we use rattan, which is like a cousin to bamboo. When you're fighting hard suit, you're wearing harder material. But yeah, it's far less historically accurate than just about, it's still important, and still a lot of people try and focus on that. But it's definitely not the first thing we focus on when we're fighting hard suit, is how accurate the armor is.
Yeah, it's more about safety. I mean, we do a chess match where we do combat for, basically festival goers, and then I do film specifically. But when we do the chess match, I mean, we also cut corners in terms of safety. One, no one is allowed to not be fully clothed. I mean, if you're a peasant, you're not going to be wearing armor, right?
Yeah.
But you have to be fully clothed. You have to have gloves, whether the person would have had it or not. Boots or shoes, depending on the period. A lot of us wear boots that they never would have worn, but some of us, like me, I wear a little bit too much leather, which is not prevalent in the medieval period. I think that for me is more of an aesthetic thing. But we also dull our weapons, because we have real swords, we have real daggers. I have a real Viking sax. I didn't dull my sax, but I'm stupid. But the rule is to dull your weapon, and we do our combat slowly at first. It's we call slow speed. It's like 25th of what would be performance speed. Performance speed would be just slower than actual combat, because as you know, real medieval fighting and fighting in general, it doesn't take a minute or 2 minutes. It's usually pretty quick, especially if you got a good weapon.
Usually pretty quick, yeah.
Yeah, or a horse, especially a horse.
Or a horse.
But moving from the combat perspective, then obviously you mentioned you are specific at the moment in artistry of bard. I do music. I record and compose music myself. Nothing. I don't have any, aside from a Chinese violin. I don't have any historical instruments. But do you use anything historical?
I'm more of a storyteller, though I've been getting into songwriting. I can play instruments. I play piano. I can play a little bit of violin, a little guitar. I was a flautist for a while. I'm learning to play, it's called a lute, a Chinese lute. Now, the actual instrument of the lute, like when you're talking about lutes, is incredibly difficult to play, incredibly expensive, and there's only 40 masters in the US, and you kind of really have to find one of them. So I'm learning to play kind of a Middle Eastern Chinese equivalent. Not quite as hard. It's got that same body shape, the big round guitar with the little bent head.
Yeah.
But for the most part, when I do sing, I either have friends that play guitars, or we do have a handful of like lute players. Uh, What is the word I'm looking for? Harps. We have a couple harps in the S.C.A, flutes, things like that will accompany me, or I'll sing or do something that doesn't necessarily need accompaniment, just
Yeah.
because I don't currently know how to. It's kind of hard to pick up a piano and put it in the middle of, of a field.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I am trying to upgrade or we call it, we call it a leveling up. Trying to level up, because part of that peerage. So, plenty of people do this that don't have the end goal of a peerage, but part of that peerage journey is finding a master. It's called belted because we delineate who is who in the S.C.A from symbols, and one of those big symbols is belts. So knights, for example, wear a white belt, and the students of the peers wear different colored belts. So laurels, which is what I'm going for, are green belts, and I'm belted to Viscountess Wander. And so I've been, doing certain tasks and trying to make myself known as a bard. And I think one of the big things that's going to help me there is learning to play an instrument, especially one like a lute or a guitar, or something that I can take with me to events. So that's kind of like the thing that I've been trying to do, or starting to do, now that I've really decided where I want to do in the S.C.A.
Exactly. I had a similar fashion when we did some pirate shows. I watched Inuyasha, and all
Love
the music
Inuyasha.
all the music in the Inuyasha is pretty much just an erhu, which is an ancient Chinese violin. And so I picked that up and played that for a pirate show, which may or may not have been relevant to the show, but yeah, whatever. So I
You
have
can
that.
never go wrong with an erhu, so I won't judge you.
Yeah, no, I don't know any ancient music with the erhu or really anything, or even Inuyasha music. But I can play music that I compose or music that I like David Bowie or something, on an erhu, just because I know where all the letters are. Um, so I think a good part of that, in terms of picking up a medieval instrument, is figuring out where you are on, lay out your pieces on the board, and then just kind of go from there on the gist of, basically the gist of how to play it, right? The nuance, like the
Yeah,
nuance of
and
a sax.
I don't disagree. Yeah, I actually, when I deeply encourage people when they're like, what instrument should I learn to learn to play the piano, because as you said, you have all of your notes in front of you. It's also, I think, the base for, really learning to read music, and then it is really a matter of just transcribing that from instrument to instrument. The issue I'm running into, and this is a very personal and embarrassing issue, is I have very small hands,
Okay,
which
yeah,
has made
same.
holding string instruments. I learned to play on a kid's guitar, um, and, and ukulele are like my practices, and then it's just a matter of like stretching to reach the right notes.
Yeah,
But it's fun, and I definitely agree that it is just a matter of figuring out how to make your notes, and then once you sort of have that, you can really easily translate it from instrument to instrument, which
indeed.
is like, it's
I
like
sort
half
of
the fun.
Yeah, I sort of had the small finger thing too. So there's some chords I just avoid on a guitar,
Yeah,
because
exactly. Like,
no need. But moving on from the instrument aspect, obviously you say you're more orator, more vocal
yeah.
in terms of that. Do you write your own lyrics? And if you do, when you do, do you think of yourself as a medieval character or perspective, or are you sort of integrating something modern into it?
I do write my own. I was a poet in my mundane life. I was an English major, literature focus. I'm a massive Tolkien fan.
Hmm.
Um, I think we all are to some extent, but that was specifically my focus. And so I started out by being inspired by that and writing poetry and writing stories. And then once I started doing poetry, I started filking, which is where you take, and it can go the other way too. You can put uh, either lyrics that you already know to a new tune, or you can take a tune and put new lyrics to it. The like really famous example is Greensleeves, which became What Child Is This? But there are lots and lots of examples of, the tune Whiskey in the Jar is,
Hmm.
has 19 different tune has 19 different Irish drinking songs that go along with it. So that's called a fill.
Exactly.
So I started filking, and I do put myself in kind of a medieval mindset. So I'm very vocal and boisterous and outgoing in my mundane life. But I really love and adapted to the like cliche D&D bard persona of too much of a flirt and too much in her drinks and too much all of that a hedonist, and I really enjoy getting to play that character. So I put myself in Runa's shoes and what she would be doing. Now the pieces I don't write are really traditionally skaldics, which is like a very specific kind of bardic that a Viking would have done. I do a lot more like really honestly the S.C.A. we call it it's pseudo medieval, where you get like those sweet Irish drinking songs that really were written in like the 1800s and 1900s, but they hit that same kind of like, this sounds just enough. I do a lot of that. They hit the aesthetic. I do a lot of like, they hit the aesthetic writing. So I'll write a tune that has something to do with Viking gods, and like it's cool and it's hitting that aesthetic, but doesn't sound necessarily like what they would have written. I'm running a bardic competition right now called Coyote's Call, the Solar Bardic Challenge, and it's for 6 months. You have to write one new piece of some kind. So for this month, I'm writing a haiku. And I took Japanese. I speak a little bit of Japanese. It fall every year. I don't, use it. I live in Arizona. It gets harder and harder to use it. I lose it, and they're a little more complicated than the whole 757 or 575. Yeah. Going on, because in Japanese, kanjis hold individual meaning. Like we can sit here and go over. So I just wrote a haiku that I'm going to perform in Japanese once I translate it. And it won't exactly be how a haiku would have been written, but it's going to be close enough. But I put myself in like, what would Runa be doing when she's writing a story in Norway in the 8th century, and how would she be inspired to do that? And that I have found that finding that mindset of like, and even if I move that, like what would my bard be doing in this kind of like, if I'm trying to like find a feeling, like I wrote a love song, and like what would I have been doing that would have inspired this? And that makes it a lot more fun, but two, a lot more I'm able to not just get that aesthetic, but get that exact emotion that I'm trying to go for when I'm able to put myself in that like medieval mindset.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a transition into this, but no, same. I don't think I've ever played a bard in the shows that we do, specifically as I don't have an instrument that would be appropriate. If I did, I'd more just sit around and play the instrument. But I've got some friends, and we occasionally will find like the weird coffee shop in our festival and do like slam poetry as our characters. For me back then, obviously, being a little cheeky in Florida, I would like to grab something that's usually from David Bowie, because I love Bowie, and Bowie's definitely a character actor in his music. But usually something from like Marilyn Manson, which is very sort of a out of left field for the area that I lived in.
A little bit, yeah.
And sort of integrate that into the character. And like last year, I played a priest. Not last year, the year before, the normal year, and there was definitely a lot of Marilyn Manson integrated into that, which to me, being a little cheeky rebel, knowing very few people are going to get something like that. The sort of dynamic of playing a preacher, a medieval preacher, mind you, and then integrating a character that is very sort of, I wouldn't say the complete
antithesis a little bit.
Yeah, and then sort of watching how people react and be like, oh yeah, that's cool, whatever. I'm like, you don't know. But for me, yeah, when I do like medieval stuff, I definitely will normally take from Bowie, because he's got such a timeless sense of lyrics. Granted, most of his lyrics are written by a robot, so it's fine. But beyond music, and I think I've lost my transition. But let me find it here. It was in terms of artistry, and so while I think on that, I'm actually going to ask something that I thought of prior to. In terms of the artistry, obviously you mentioned you do more music and you also do the fighting and the fight aspect. But is there anybody that does, because this is a common sort of sidebar topic on the podcast, is we mentioned the really bad medieval art, like a really bad embroidery. Is there any like facet to that in S.C.A where someone like specifically wants to do like medieval cats or that medieval style that they had back then, whether it's painting or embroidery? Have you seen any of that?
So we have when we've got a lot of we love the nonsense they got up to in the Middle Ages. And a big part of like especially like the quote unquote bad or cheeky or whatever illuminations you see is a lot of the people who became monks who did or priests who did a lot of that were like 12th sons in families that had a bunch of kids and didn't expect them all to survive. And then, the first son gets the land and the second son gets an education and the third and fourth son are like, guess you gotta go be a priest now because we can't take care of you. And so they were
Yeah.
like these bored 12-year-olds who maybe, or 12 to 40, 50, 60-year-olds who maybe didn't want to be a man of the cloth. So you'll find, and it's also a lot of it is symbolic. But you'll find a lot of like that dumb cheeky artistry. We love it. We love it. We have the pins. My personal favorite, of course, and sounds like a plan. My personal favorite is there's this beautiful illumination of nuns picking penis fruit off of a tree. We have a group of scribes in my kingdom, which is the state of Arizona. It's the kingdom of Aidenvelt. A group of scribes is called the scriptorium, and we're the ones who make the awards that go out. And the heads of our scriptorium got those pins. But we have an event in my barony. So the S.C.A, you have the known world, which is everyone, then individual kingdoms, and then usual cities have baronies. So my barony is Barony of Teriskathir, which is Barony of the Boar, because we have javelinas here. We have an event called God Awful, which has a whole lore that comes with it. It's the Holy Grail, but it's really hideous and all of these things. But people get to really bring their particularly heinous period art there. So, butt trumpets, which was a popular illumination, and ugly garb. And there was a whole group of German fighters that existed in Germany called Landsknechts, and they were really gaudy. Yeah, so because they used to, peel pieces off of their foes. So I've seen people show up in like we have an entire group of Landsknechts in the S.C.A, and we love them. But I've seen people show up in like the gaudiest Landsknecht armor they could. I've personally found the ugliest cloak that I could find that has a historical accuracy and brought it. We love to see it. We love just terrible medieval nonsense, and that's the event where we really get to be like, and now you get to see all of it in one place. But yeah, we really lean into the like, they were clearly smoking something in the Middle Ages. Let's go.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely want to do an episode specifically on the art of the medieval period, because for me, I think a lot of it is so bad, like comically bad, like medieval cats and looking at the Bay Tapestry and how flat everybody looks, and you look at the art that people are putting out today, or even in the Renaissance period, and how just dramatic it all is, and I'm like, where were these people on the canvas who were doing all of this beautiful art to their furniture back then? Because I don't know if you know, when I look back at things of like the 900s or earlier, and you look at just literally specifically furniture from like museum pieces, they had the most ornate, mundane decorations, and it's like, this is clearly not the Dark Ages. If we stepped into the medieval period, I feel like it would look like the most beautiful like ballroom. Maybe not peasants, but you know what I mean. Like it wouldn't be a bunch of torches and bland clothes. It would be very ornate.
And there's sort of two facets to that. One part is actually our idea of what the medieval culture's war isn't always completely accurate.
Exactly.
You know, we have like the idea of what Vikings wore, but we've done, and I say we, so like I travel a lot. So I went to Norway with my fighter, and we went to the museums, and they had to read, the cloth has been sitting in a bog for hundreds of years. They wore incredibly bright clothing that's faded. The Persians wore incredibly gaudy and bright clothing. Even peasants had clothing that was brightly colored. But the other half of that, where the really ugly art comes in,
Hmm.
was a lot of these people weren't seeing these things. It was being described to them. So my absolute favorite example, um, I was in Japan, and I was in a feudal lord's house, and it was beautiful and wonderful, and there were all sorts of interesting things. But there was this room that was painted with these bizarre looking animals. And what had happened is these people was playing a game of telephone. So they were trying to draw lions, and someone had described to them what a lion looked like. And that person had had a lion described to them, and they'd never seen a lion before. So they just like put it on there. It was like, I don't know.
Hmm.
So you run into that with like really, really wild looking things where it's like that was just something this person never saw. You get a
Yeah.
lot of like analogies. So you see a lot of examples of like snails battling people. And a big part of that is that was a big problem for a society who needed food. And if they didn't get food for the winter, they die. And if the pests in the fields ate all of their food, you get a lot of the really crazy art is either analogy or a person had something described to them and they were just like, I've never seen this before, so I'm just going to take my best guess. And
Yeah.
then, of course, jizz. I love it. I love all that nonsense. It's been my favorite
Hmm.
part of being a scribe is getting to learn like merled dogs, like dogs that have tiger stripes or patches, like scribes who were not really necessarily trained artists like they were, but maybe it wasn't their calling, didn't want to sit there and like draw that. So they painted the dogs purple. And it
Hmm.
was just shorthand. It was scribal shorthand for this dog is spotted, but I didn't want to draw it that day. So you'll see art where animals are bizarre colors, and those colors were meant to represent this animal has stripes or this animal has spots, or
Yeah.
and they would have known that. But even taking all of that into account, you run into some real ugly, bizarre art in the Middle Ages, and I think it's the funniest thing on earth. So I
Yeah.
would absolutely listen to an entire episode roasting artists of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's like I would describe it as like if you looked at just the art alone as a basis for medieval history, some people might take the never-ending story as fact,
Yeah, absolutely.
basically. Oh, but I did remember my transition point, so I just have like two other questions left in regards to that. But yeah, one thing we do, some of us, a few of us, small handful of us, method acting. Um, method acting. Obviously, with S.C.A, you guys seem very intense in terms of, or at least now, trying to find your roots historically and trying to find some semblance of character. I definitely want to sort of separate it from LARP. LARP is definitely a different thing, and I know I have some friends at LARP. I do not, but for us, obviously, some people take it more seriously. Some people don't take it seriously enough, and some just not at all. But a few of us, and literally just a few, really get into their characters. For me, sometimes I don't quite get into it until I've written like a I don't want to say a fanfic, but like a small story in character or about the character. Each year, and I kind of stopped, but each year I would sort of like write like a 3,000 word short story from the perspective of the character in the time frame and try to be as historically accurate as possible, and that would really get me into prep for the show itself to be in character. Is there anything that you guys do that sort of gets you into that realm, that mentality, that sort of method acting, or is some of it just really just putting on some clothes and walking around and feigning a Norris or British accent?
So this is where you kind of hit a divide in the society. And now I'm going to get myself in trouble, but I'm going to
No,
do it anyway. I actually do kind of consider the S.C.A. LARP, and a lot of people get really mad at it. We even say, oh, it's a game, and some people are like, it's not a game, it's a lifestyle. And I'm like, all right, let's rein it in a little bit. Because a big part of the S.C.A. is choosing a persona and playing that persona, and in my personal opinion, that is, you're in the real world, you're role playing, feels like a LARP just a little bit. And I get a lot of finger wagging and like, it's not a LARP. And I'm like, okay. And some people absolutely do. So for example, we just recently started our own wikis, which is something some kingdoms did, but Aidenvelt didn't. And I've always, when I started building my persona, I was really torn between a Japanese persona, because there are some Japanese personas in the S.C.A, but it's a hard persona to do well, because the Japanese, we work with the assumption that we're all nobility, so we can have access to like wearing the beautiful clothing and the justification. But nobility in, let's say, medieval Japan is very expensive to do well. So a lot of people cut corners. They're wearing things like yukatas, which is not something that was even really introduced till the very tail end of what would be considered the medieval era, and was something you'd wear in a bathhouse, not necessarily out. And like, as someone who really enjoyed Japanese culture, I kind of wanted to do it justice. But I also really liked Viking because it was such a matriarchal society, and I really enjoyed,
Yep.
well, let's be honest, the aesthetic. I really enjoy the lore. And so I sat myself down and I did write. I wrote two perspectives from two different personas. And I found myself truly fitting in with Runa. And I know a lot of people who do it that way. They'll write their wikis. I knew a woman, Mo, whose persona was Spanish, but she wanted to wear different clothing. So she came up with an entire story of, my character was born here and raised here and married this person so that she could have access to that clothing and really bring her character to life. Some people really, the accents, like you said, not always well, but you know what? A for effort. That really helps them. What really helped me the most was, like I said, I went to Norway, was in the Viking Ships Museum. I knew the kind of character I wanted to play, and I was surrounded by all that, and I sat myself down in front of the Viking ship and imagined what Runa would exist in this ship and how that would look for her. And that really helps me. And writing down your entire character history is something that a lot of us find ourselves doing. So like, where were you born? Who was your family? Who were you apprenticed to? How did you die? Is a popular one. I know someone who plays the handmaiden of a handmaiden of Queen Elizabeth, and that like really helps her. She's close enough to the action that she has touchstones for really truly historical events that she can really bring her character to. For me, it's a little bit more broad. It's more like aesthetics. Like, I have, stupid Pinterest boards that are like help inspire me, and then I have lots of historical books, and I have pages tabbed, and I bring all that together, and I'll write every now and then, like, if not a short story, like a little like checklist of like, who is Runa and what is she like every year, because my persona adapts as I grow as a person. But on the other hand, you have people who join the S.C.A. not because they could give one flying flip about the medieval ages, but because it was a fun place to party, or because they think hitting their friends with sticks is fun, or because they find it rewarding to run events. And those people, like, they'll wear clothes from every single era. They'll have personas that may or may not be passed because they liked the name and they thought it was cool. A completely legitimate way to play in the S.C.A, but they're not the people who are really like method acting, like getting their persona really tied down and realized. So you do find that divide. But for those of us who are like in it, we do have different methods of writing our wikis and researching our personas and then bringing that into the real world.
Exactly. Same here on two topics in regards to that, but I'll work backwards. Obviously, we have that too. Obviously, we are very strictly historically accurate in terms of attire and such. Accent too. We have a lot of tools that I'd like to upload into the Discord specifically that we use to get into accents. But every year, there's always someone that dresses up as Thor and shows up. There's always some very young girl who dresses up as like a Victorian princess. Or one year, and I don't know how this ended up getting past the directors, but one of the fighters dressed up as Superman throughout the show. Sweatpants, cape, all that, and we're just like, I'm not the director. But there you go. Okay. Absolute wonderful person though, but yeah, some people, I think, in terms of depending on if your kingdom or show is serious or not, some people have varying levels of getting it. But also working backwards from there. In terms of that, you mentioned kingdom, and obviously we should have probably mentioned that first, because in S.C.A. there's kingdoms, and I didn't mention yours. What is your kingdom that you attribute with?
I think I did mention it myself, but it's
Yeah.
Aidenvelt. It was the second kingdom. We were born out of the kingdom of the West, which was the first kingdom. And there's a lot of controversy to how we were born, because in Aidenvelt, the story we're told is we decided to be our own kingdom, and the king of the West failed to show up to crown our new king 3 separate times because he was a little bit bitter. Like the West was a little bit bitter. We were breaking off. So our kings crowned themselves as opposed to having the previous king crown them, to pay homage to that story. Now, if you ask the West, that's not at all what happened. So it is really one of those he said, she said situations. But that's Aidenvelt. It means it's a little bit of a mispronunciation of a bunch of different things, but it's meant to mean land of the sun.
And then, of course, in finality, S.C.A. is not just people getting together on the internet. Obviously, you guys do events. I've heard of like big battles and stuff like that. What kind of events have you done or know of or seen that sort of best encapsulate the S.C.A.?
So we're broken up from local events and kingdom events and society events. So a local event might be, most big cities have a college, which is based out of their university. That's how I got started in the S.C.A. It was an accident. I was an archer for a long time, in like just a mundane archer. And my college counselor thought the College of St. Felix was an archery club, but it wasn't. It was the most local event for the S.C.A. It was a local club. I joined. I was immediately in love because that was everything that I wanted. And we had our barony, the barony of Triscathir, one of, there's 9 baronies in Aidenvelt, and then the kingdom. College practice is a very local, small event. It's just college kids doing hardsuit fighting, rapier fighting, whatever art they want to do. Baronial events are a little bit bigger, a little bit more fun. We have Toast and Toast in BTY, which is a really fun, intimate event where everyone in BTY goes up to the mountain and we all cook together as our households. And we boast or toast each other. So you'll boast something you did, or you'll toast to something. We have, like I said, God Awful Grail. We have Great Helm, which is where the Baron and Baroness pick their new guard based on these fighting. So most events are either fighting focused or have fighting there. And then we have wars, are usually the kingdom events. There's usually one kingdom ANS, which is arts and sciences, a year, and that's where all the artists come out with all of their things. The big things we have are wars. So we have a S.C.A war here in Aidenvelt. It's generally speaking between our kingdom, Aidenvelt, and the kingdom Caid, which is in New Mexico. And then a couple other ones, but those are like the big fighters. There's Great Western War, which is the Kingdom of the West in California. And then the big, probably the biggest S.C.A event in the known world is Penzic. It's in Pennsylvania. It's such a big event, it gets its own post office and postal code for the weeks that it's running. But you have every scale. If you just want to hang out with like 12 to 15 people, to maybe 100 people, to maybe 1,000 people, to maybe 10,000 people, we got you however you want to live. But those wars are our big events because you have the fighting, and then at night you have everyone either in their baronies or like our barony, BTY, we have a lot of households, which is, I'm going to call them guilds because I think that's going to be an easy way for people to understand. It's groups of people who are trying to meet the same ideal or aesthetic. My house is Rothenheim. We're all Rus or Viking personas. We're all playing in about the same country. We're all fighting together. We do art together. We cook together. You have the Lance Connects. You have Delarock. So you have a lot of households that at night we'll set up big fire pits, and then at night you get to go from fire to fighter and drink together and sing together and eat together. And that those wars are really what bring people to the S.C.A. So those are our big events that I think most people think of when they're thinking the society.
So yeah, that's incredible. What I do is literally just a festival. It's a medieval fair. We just got 50 acres, but I mean, it's still the same festival. Obviously, with the pandemic is going to be an interesting dynamic, but we love doing the show, and it's basically the same sort of scenario for us. You know, we do it for us, and the festival does it for the people. But you know, obviously, S.C.A has a bigger history, I think, in terms of getting a wider audience, like a convention, like a film, anime, furry, whatever convention, you know, gets people from all around the world engaged in that. So if anyone listening, of course, is interested, they should check it out. But that'll be that for this episode. Of course, I am NC, the host.
And I'm Runa or Zoe, or you can find me at Bard Coyote at Instagram.
And that is it for that. So we will see you next time where we discuss whatever we are discussing in terms of medieval history.